Viewed from the sea, these mountains of South Mull stand back from the ocean. The intervention of that dark wall of cliffs erases their sculptural shapes from the waist down. Their disembodied mountain tops are curiously diminished from here, retiring, airy, spacious. But the cliffs, like all good curtain walls, are indomitable, a brotherhood hewn from the island's own raw materials, impervious to invaders, whether armies or oceans, and in this case, accommodating to sea eagles. A few minutes ago, a small, scruffy, bald man came and stood at the rail a few yards away and began to scan the cliffs, the inshore waters below them, and the sky above them with binoculars, working systematically east to west, then back again. If his binoculars had been a motor car, they would have had a flying lady on the bonnet, an RR badge on the grille. I have what I consider to be good binoculars, and they're certainly the best I've ever owned, but I also have a slight knowledge of the market, and my best guess is that his were from the outer edge of the optical stratosphere. I decided that's why I couldn't afford clothes. A kind of squeal emerged involuntarily from his open mouth, and he shifted excitedly on his feet, but without moving anywhere. I looked where he was looking. I saw nothing. He squealed again, apparently oblivious as well as involuntarily, and I tried to think where I'd seen him before. Then it struck me. He could have been almost any character out of a Giles cartoon. I used to love them, but hadn't seen one or even thought about one in 40 years. But if Mr. Giles had been standing where I stood right then, I think he would have been reaching for a pad and a pen and thanking the Colonsay ferry for dropping a sprinkle of gold dust into his lap. The binoculared one was about 5'4", 5'5". He wore a faded yellow shirt, both short-sleeved and too short of girth at the waist to accommodate a slightly pendulous stomach. As a result, shirt and trousers did not quite meet at the front. He might have been 55. The little hair he had was very blonde and stood on end, having been back-combed by the sea wind. His trousers, pale blue and prolifically stained, seemed to have pockets all the way down, some of them quite out of reach unless he sat down. On his feet were red trainers with white soles. It occurred to me then that while I was taken up with this rare subspecies of fairy fauna, he could well be watching a sea eagle. And given that he was watching it through binoculars in the same price range as a nice wee terraced house in Dundee with front and back gardens and a river view, I thought that I detected an internal twinge of envy at the quality of the image he was enjoying. As a rule, I'm not much of a student of my fellow man, and even less so in such a theatre of nature as the island-splashed sea south of Mull. But there was something likably hobbity about this creature, so that I half expected him to turn towards me suddenly and exclaim, "Gandalf, Gandalf, good gracious me!" But instead, when he did turn to me, there being no one else in sight on that portion of the deck at that moment, smiling a knowing, even confiding smile, what he actually exclaimed, in what I imagined to be an Oxford University professorish voice, was, "Well, that deserves a cup of cake and a cup of Calmac tea." So that explains the tummy, I thought. And then I wondered if he thought that Calmac was a species of tea like chamomile or lapsang souchong. And if he did, he was in for a bit of a letdown, for I've had Calmac tea, and in all fairness, it's nothing to write home about. As Gandalf would say, "Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." And off he stomped, the hobbity one, to his cake and pot of Calmac, and doubtless to fill a pipe and blow smoke rings. I turned back to the sea cliffs, pointed my suddenly inferior glasses a little higher than I'd been looking before, and there I found her. She hefted high and low the most extensive acreage of wings anyone ever saw along that shore, wings like hung sheets of dark silk, wings like furrowed fields. With these she rose steeply from sea cliff shadows into oceanic sunlight, and at once she paled, for a sea eagle is dark, only in dark shadow or in silhouette, and her upper wings and her head especially are often mottled light tan and pale grey that can look almost white in the right light. And then her tail shines like snowlight, and her beak is the colour of daffodils, for all that it's as lethal as a bushman's machete. You can never think of her as beautiful in the way that a gold eagle can be, but at that moment she achieved a singularly prepossessing presence even in the company of such a daunting land and seascape as the south coast of Mull, as if a fragment of the cliff face had broken free, become animated, and taken flight. Once on Mull, where I saw something like an old rotting wooden post standing on a muddy shore. Only my long familiarity with that particular shore persuaded me to look twice, for I knew that there was no wooden post there. The binoculars showed it up for what it was, a white-tailed eagle, standing erect, apparently staring at a crab and wondering what to do with it. Eventually it lost interest and walked a few yards across the shore looking, I imagine, a bit like a hobbit. Strange how hobbits keep insinuating themselves into a chapter titled The Nature of Second Spring. But after all, at the end of Bilbo's journey, the desolation was now filled with birds and blossoms in spring. And the prophecies of the old songs have turned out to be true. Somewhere between the Colonsay Ferry and the moment at which I sat down to write a book titled The Nature of Spring, it occurred to me that this reinvigorated state of affairs resulting in the desolation being filled once again with birds and blossom in spring has taken exactly 100 years. The very last seagull of the original Scottish population was shot in Shetland in 1918, 8 years after its mate had been shot, 8 years in which it had returned annually to the same airy cliff where it waited for another of its own tribe to appear. But by then there was no tribe left. 2 failed attempts at trial reintroductions occurred in the 1950s and 60s, but it wasn't until 1975 that a properly resourced scheme administered by the Old Nature Conservancy Council began on Rum. The tide finally began to turn in the bird's favour, and a second spring dawned for the white-tailed eagle. So that spring of 2018 that was so ill-starred for so many of nature's tribes was also something of a landmark, something of a history maker, something of a breakthrough in the vexing annals of humankind's relationship with nature. The celebrations may have been muted, but even muted celebrations are worth raising a glass to.